I'm the Bible Charts Guy, and this is the hidden pattern in the book of Romans. Download this chart in the description below, hit subscribe, and let's learn something new about Paul's greatest letter. Most students of Romans recognize it as 4 parts: justification in 1-4, sanctification in 5-8, Israel in 9-11, and an application in 12-15. But many fail to notice these tiny boxes in between the large sections. These are transitions between the greater movements in Paul's theological argument. Far from insignificant filler, these short transition moments between Paul's main sections teach us how we are to respond to the lofty theology unveiled before us. And, incredibly, each of these sections is tied together by means of shared themes and vocabulary. The letter of Romans is even more sophisticated than you realized, and you're about to find out why. But let's first do a quick walkthrough of the 4 main sections in Paul's letter. In 1-4, he's going to lay out his gospel of salvation. And this is a gospel for both Jews and Gentiles because it justifies by faith apart from works of the law. And this gospel will continue its work in us in 5-8 after we are saved. But this progress of sanctification also happens apart from the law, because it is the Spirit which sets us free from the sinful nature and not the law. But if in fact nothing can separate us from the love of God in chapter 8, why is Israel separated from God right now in their rejection of the Messiah? Well, Paul is going to defend the faithfulness of God in 9-11, explaining Israel's present rejection of the Messiah, but also their future acceptance and regathering. Finally, in 12-15, Paul will conclude by arguing that the gospel creates unity. Unity in that we are one body, though composed of many members. However, this specifically is a unity between the weak and the strong. That is, between the Jews who keep the Mosaic law and the Gentiles who do not. Those are Paul's 4 main theological movements, and bracketing these at the beginning and ending of his letter is a brief word about his desire to visit the church in Rome. But now we get to that hidden pattern in Romans, these tiny boxes, the transitions between movements in chapters 5, 8, 11, and 15. Now I'm calling these transitions doxological confessions because they are praise pauses. Moments when Paul pauses in his theological exposition in order to praise the God of this theology and marvel at his calling of us. But what's incredible is that each of these doxological confessions have been woven together such that they maintain a conversation between them about the same set of common ideas. For example, 3 of them are going to worship God in light of our future hope. And specifically, this is a hope in the midst of suffering. And then in chapter 11, Paul is going to glorify God for his plan of redemption in the salvation of both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, let's finally look at the text of these doxological transitions and see them in action. So we have 4 main theological movements, a matching introduction and conclusion, and then 4 doxological transitions. The first one is here in chapter 5. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we rejoice in hope. Now, this word rejoice was used back in chapter 4 to conclude Paul's theology of justification. In chapter 5, that word, kaukaomai, is translated as rejoice. But in chapter 4, it is translated as boast. If Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about. But we don't boast in our works. Rather, returning to chapter 5, we boast in God and we boast in hope. This same hope both begins and ends Paul's magnificent letter of Romans, where he prays that they would both be filled with and abound in hope. What about chapter 8? Does it address our future hope as well? Absolutely. Chapter 8 abounds in hope. Paul's whole argument in 8:5-30 is that in this present life, we are to walk by the Spirit as we wait for hope. Waiting waiting specifically in chapter 8, verse 23, for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But the transition statement at the end of chapter 8 also celebrates this hope. So why are we more than conquerors in this life? Because of our hope that he will graciously give us all things in the next life. But returning to chapter 5, Paul teaches that the believer rejoices in hope, but also that he rejoices in their suffering. Now remember, this is a hope in suffering, a hope in the midst of tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, and sword. But how can we maintain this hope in such hopeless circumstances? Well, it is because of God's love that has been poured into our hearts. That is why we are more than conquerors, through him who loved us. And God most clearly demonstrated this love for us on the cross. For God showed this love for us, and that while we were sinners, he died for us. It is Christ Jesus who died for the ungodly. And this death both reconciled us to God and justifies us. But I called these doxological transitions, didn't I? Praise pauses. Look at how the love of God causes Paul to overflow in worship here in chapter 8. Therefore, in light of all of this, Paul will ask 4 times, who? Who can be against us? Who can bring any charge against God's elect? Who is to condemn? Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Paul uses the same pattern of praise in his final doxological transition in chapter 11, where he asks, who is like God? For who has known the mind of the Lord? Who has been his counselor? Who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. That is how we should respond to the lofty theology of Romans. To him be the glory forever. Another book with key transition statements is the Gospel of Matthew. If you want to see how Jesus' own sermons divide this gospel into 5 perfect pieces, you should check out this next video.